If I say the name Pythagoras, you probably turn this video off and run away thinking of mathematical problems and triangles. But please don't do that, because there's much more to Pythagoras than that. He was around some 2,500 years ago, about the same time as the Buddha. And although we think of him now primarily as a mathematician, he coined terms like the cosmos and philosophy. He was an astronomer and a philosopher. He spoke the Egyptian language fluently. He taught gender equality at a time when that was all but unheard of. He was all for having women in the upper echelons of government and other institutions. And he also discovered much of what still today underpins our understanding of music and harmony and pitch. He studied the notes in the musical scale and looked at how long a string you would need to make each of those notes. So a longer string has a lower note, a shorter string makes a higher note. He looked at the ratios of those different lengths of strings and discovered that the notes that are an exact octave apart in music are precisely double one another in terms of their harmonic frequency. And so the notes that are closely related in the way we write and play music have got scientific properties that mean they are connected by the laws of nature. But for Pythagoras, music was more than just a series of sums, and this is more what we're going to be looking at today. He was one of the first known people to prescribe music as a form of medicine. Harmonia was the concept of bringing order to chaos, as in the word harmony, like you might see in nature. And Pythagoras felt that music was one way that this could be achieved. And so he saw that music could bring the faculties of the soul into harmony, that it could compose and purify the mind, and that it could heal the physical body and help maintain perfect health. Now, I wouldn't say that I am in perfect health, and I would say the same is probably true of many other musicians. But I do think Pythagoras was onto something, that music can have a profound effect in healing both mental and physical illness. He also felt that music was part of any good education. He and other ancient philosophers like Plato developed and wrote what evolved into the 7 liberal arts. These began with the trivium, the 3 first subjects that would be studied, which were grammar, logic, and rhetoric. But these were swiftly followed by the quadrivium, which was arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And all told, these 7 liberal arts were seen as the subjects that developed thinking skills. And they were the mainstay right through medieval universities, really to the Renaissance times. So I find it interesting that music was right at the heart of that. It was seen as being on an equal level with subjects like arithmetic and geometry, which perhaps in our curriculum today are given precedence. Part of the reason why these philosophers saw music as being so important was that they believed in the harmony of the spheres, or musica universalis. So this is the ancient philosophical concept that saw celestial bodies like the planets and the sun and stars moving around together in a way that actually created a form of music. Wasn't audible to us, but that there was a harmonic, mathematical, religious resonance in the way that they moved. Now, of course, there's a great deal that we understand now in terms of how the brain works that wasn't known 2,500 years ago. And the rate at which neuroscience has developed in the last couple of decades is frankly extraordinary. But I find it remarkable that even with the scientific knowledge we now have, we find that actually these ancient philosophers were right about so much. They were right that music can affect our brain and our body and our well-being, and they were right that it is in some way fundamental to our being and to life on Earth. It could have been that science would disprove them, but actually we have a lot of concrete evidence from a lot of research that music really does affect the brain and affect our bodies. At this point, I should introduce myself. My name is Libby Burgess. I am by no means a philosopher or a classicist, and I'm definitely not a neuroscientist, but I am a musician. I play the piano for a living, I work with singers, I teach, I coach, and I'm fascinated by the way that the brain and music interact. The human brain is one of the most complex structures that exists in nature. The average human brain is about 15 centimetres, weighs about 1.3 kilograms, and in that there are about 85 billion nerve cells, which is pretty mind-blowing. Our human brain is quite similar to other mammal brains in its structure, but relative to the size of our body, it's much bigger. So our brain is responsible for forming our thoughts, preserving our memories, regulating our activities. It initiates and coordinates basically everything that our body does. The brain is in many sections, given that it has so many different tasks to carry out. The hindbrain is the bit that in evolutionary terms is the most primitive and fundamental. It's the oldest, so it links to the basics of keeping a body alive. It regulates our breathing and our balance and our movement. Whereas the forebrain is what sets us apart from other vertebrates. So it is large and complicated and deals with things like reasoning and problem solving, and hormones and complex motor functions. Within the forebrain, there are many areas. There's the whole limbic system, which deals with emotions and memory. There's our cerebrum, which is the largest and most highly developed part of the brain. This deals with intelligence and personality and thinking and language, and motor function and planning and organisation. Within the cerebrum, there are two hemispheres, the right and left. We often say that someone is right-brained or left-brained, that just as we're right-handed or left-handed, one side of our brain is dominant. The left-brained people are those who are thought of as being very logical and dealing with pattern and language, whilst right-brained people are thought of as being more creative and thinking in terms of images and spatial awareness and things like that. The two sides of the brain have to talk to one another to get things done, and we're going to come back to that point. The area over the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex. This is the grey, wrinkly part of the brain, which evolved in that way so that there would be more surface area of the brain than if it were flat. All the wrinkles, if you smooth them out, would give a great amount of surface, but without our heads needing to evolve to be so big as to keep the whole thing, if it weren't wrinkled, if it were flat, we'd need a huge head, and that would have disadvantaged us as a species, I'm sure. And so the solution is this very wrinkly texture at the cerebral cortex. This is the ultimate control centre of the brain, deals with perception and association and thought and memory, lots of information being processed, awareness, language, consciousness. Within this part of the brain, there are different lobes. The frontal lobe that deals with executive function, some of our highest cognitive processes. The temporal lobe that deals with short and long-term memory. The occipital lobe that deals with visual processing, the parietal lobe that deals with sensory skills. There are so many different sections here. This is barely scratching the surface of the different ways that we can look at the brain. And the development in scanning technology that enables us to see and understand what is going on in the brain has facilitated such an extraordinary expansion of this knowledge in recent decades. What I find interesting is not so much how these different sections of the brain are laid out per se, but the way that they interact with one another. Although different parts of the brain are responsible for different things, what is clear is that they are constantly interacting. Messages are pinging backwards and forwards using neurons and neurotransmitters, chemically and electrically. These messages are pinging around all the time from one section of the brain to another. It's very rare that one part of the brain is solely responsible for one aspect of how we live and function. Instead, almost everything we do requires different parts of the brain to interact and messages to be communicated across. The brain also has an extraordinary level of neuroplasticity. Until 50 years ago or so, it was thought that once a child had finished growing, the brain was basically pretty static for the rest of the adult life. And it's now understood that that is far from true, and that actually the brain keeps developing, and that neural pathways are formed and reinforced as the same pattern or idea or thought is repeated, which is why we have such a strong sense of habit as human beings. But that these neural pathways can be changed over time, and that as adults learn new information or respond perhaps to an injury or a trauma, the physical makeup of the brain continues to change. The reason I find the question of neuroplasticity and the question of using different sections of the brain so interesting is because that links directly to what we see when we study the brains of people who are involved in music. Thanks to developments in scanning technology in recent decades, we can now scan people's brains using fMRI and watch what happens as they're carrying out different activities. So we can see that if they're solving a maths problem, one part of their brain lights up. If they're reading a book, a different part of their brain lights up. If they are listening to music, what we see is that many sections of their brain light up all at once. They're processing lots of different types of information in real time and sort of knitting it all together. That is really notable. But then another step is that if the person being observed is actually playing music themselves at the time, playing an instrument, so many more parts of the brain are being used at once than for any other activity that we've been able to observe. Even other complicated and highly skilled activities or other creative arts, because music is combining the motor skills, the language, the mathematics, the emotion, the communication, all of these different fields all at once, it fires up more parts of the brain than any single other activity that we can observe. It's amazing that science confirms what we instinctively know, that music uses lots of different types of brain activity. But what I find more remarkable is that when we examine the brains of musicians, they are structurally different to people who've never played music. Brain scanning studies show that musicians have a significantly larger corpus callosum than people who've never played an instrument. The corpus callosum is the area between the two hemispheres of the brain, the right and the left. So we talked earlier about the fact that the two sides are dominant in different skill sets. Messages need to pass effectively between those two sides for our mind and our body to work efficiently and effectively. And that communication between right and left through the corpus callosum is important in eye movement and vision, it's important in maintaining attention, it's important in various tactile ways. And that part of the brain is noticeably larger in musicians. Now, that's not because those people were born with a larger corpus callosum. It's because the way their brain has been used has affected the physical structure of the brain. So the fact that musicians have been using all those different types of parts of the brain, that they've been using the right and the left both very extensively at the same time, has meant that communication has had to get quicker and better. And as a result, that part of the brain has actually changed in size. That has quite an implication for the importance of music, because what that offers, to have a bigger and stronger and quicker activity in the corpus callosum, is applicable to all sorts of other areas of life. Perhaps it's not surprising then that studies have shown that musicians have strong problem-solving skills, which they can apply to all sorts of areas, academic or social. Musicians have quick reactions. There was a study that tested musicians and non-musicians side by side. They had one hand on a computer mouse and the other hand on a box, and when the box vibrated they had to click the mouse. And perhaps because they were responding to that using multiple senses, they would hear the buzz, they would feel the buzz, just in the same way as they use multiple senses in music. The musicians in that test consistently had quicker reactions. We expect musicians to have strong skills in self-expression. That goes hand in hand, we would think, with the performing arts. But perhaps more surprising is that multiple studies show musicians have strong memory skills. The ability to create and store and retrieve memories effectively and efficiently is markedly stronger amongst musicians. It's thought perhaps this is because musicians give their memories multiple different tags when they file them. So in the same way as we can give our emails or our notes on our computer different tags, so we tag our memories when we file them, and musicians are thought to relate their memories to conceptual tags, to contextual tags, to auditory tags, to emotional tags, that are all different ways of retrieving that memory in the same way as we use all those different parts of the brain in music. Some musicians are also found to have a higher level of executive function. This is the management system of the brain, the skills involved in setting goals and planning, and getting things done. Studies show that even just learning an instrument for 14 months as a child can have significant effect on the brain for the rest of your life, which is extraordinary. One of the things that is being looked at a lot at the moment is the effect of a music education on the aging process. Hearing, for example, tends to deteriorate as adults get older, perhaps particularly being able to hear conversation in a crowded room with lots of background noise. But because musicians are used to processing a lot of auditory information in a lot of detail, the brain retains that skill if you've had a musical education as a youngster. Even if you stop playing an instrument for the intervening decades, although it's better if you keep playing it. And so experiments on this area have attached scalp electrodes to the participants and measured the timing of their neural responses in the auditory brainstem when they're played complex speech sounds. And it was really noticeable that participants with even just some musical training earlier in their life were quicker at responding to that, which means that they retain the skill of being able to hear speech more clearly for longer. Music studies have also been shown to enhance the language part of the brain, the ability to process pitch and timbre and timing. An example of this is the Harmony Project in Los Angeles, which is a non-profit after-school project that teaches music to kids from low-income backgrounds. Not only did these kids make progress at music, but their language skills improved so remarkably that more than 90% of the kids who went through the program have graduated and gone on to college, compared with a dropout rate in the neighbourhood of 50%. And that is attributed to the improvement in the language skills that derived from studying music. Similarly, a well-publicised story a few years back from a primary school in Bradford, who were stated to be a failing school by Ofsted, and their way of approaching it was to introduce so much music tuition, up to 6 hours a week for each child in the school, that actually the school has been turned around. It's rated good by Ofsted. They went from being 3.2 percentage points behind the national average in English to being 7.1 points above the average for reading, 3.4 above for writing. It's a huge turnaround. And it's even more remarkable given that at the school 99% of its more than 500 children speak English as an additional language, and half arrive at the school unable to speak a word of English. And so this is again a remarkable reflection on the importance of putting music right at the heart of education, because it enhances all these other types of brain function. So Pythagoras would have approved of that story. I've quoted various different studies and sets of research here, and it's worth saying that these are mostly not carried out by musicians. They're carried out by neuroscientists. They don't necessarily have an agenda for fighting the cause of music, but these are the discoveries that over and over again they are finding, that musical training can change the brain structure, they can change the brain function, and they can lead to better brain development. It's thought that using so many different senses, as we do in music, in synchronicity at the same time, repeatedly over a long period of time, enhances how the different parts of the brain work together. The additional neural connections created in childhood if we study music last a lifetime. So playing music isn't just fun, it isn't just a way of expressing yourself, although it is both of those things, and those are great reason in and of themselves. But it is also creating a defense against memory loss and cognitive decline and even hearing loss later in life. Well, that's all well and good, you might be saying, but what if I don't play an instrument? Is it too late? Well, no, even if you don't take up an instrument until your retirement, it still helps your brain function at that point. But in the meantime, singing is great, whether that's singing with other people or singing in the shower. When we just speak, brain scanning shows that the language part of the brain is fired up. But when we sing, it's not only the language part, but also the emotion part that is busy and active. And so that added to things like the motor control needed to articulate the words and the use of the breath means that lots of bits of brain are being used there as well. And singing has such great physical benefits. The fact that it's linked to good quality breathing is so good for you, and it's been shown recently that deep breathing doesn't only relax us, which anyone who has panic attacks will know, but that it also taps straight into the emotional parts of the brain. The physical exertion of singing also releases endorphins, which make us feel happy and euphoric. So that's another good reason for it. And furthermore, if our mood is high, our sleep patterns tend to be better, our immune system is stronger. And so there are many physical reasons for the benefit of singing. Even if you're not a singer, if your experience of music is just listening to music, that still fires up your brain. Listening to music, especially music that appeals to us, that is the music that we like and that is to our tastes, causes a surge of activity in the reward pathways in the brain. So this increases the level of dopamine, which is the same pathways as anything else that's pleasurable, whether that's eating or drinking or being physically affectionate. While all these studies show that musical training causes great benefit to the brain, actually engaging with music and listening to it is still way better than having no music in your life. We started out with Pythagoras, thinking of him as being the first music therapist. I think for as long as humans have been around and able to make music, they've known that it makes people feel better. And we know that music was featured in cave paintings from 35 or 40,000 years ago, and there are ancient flutes discovered from that time. So I think the idea that music makes us feel better is nothing new. But it was really only in the 20th century that music therapy as a profession evolved, largely in the wake of the World Wars. Musicians, amateur and professional, would visit the hospital wards where soldiers who'd been injured, who'd experienced significant physical and emotional trauma, were being treated, and these musicians would play to them. And the medics were so struck by the effect of the music on the patients that they requested that the musicians return, and gradually from this people realised that musicians working with people who'd been through such trauma needed training in how to make the most of that, and so the music therapy profession was born. Music therapy is used these days to treat a whole range of problems with a range of severity. Listening to music has been shown to lower our heart rate and blood pressure, to relieve anxiety, to reduce the presence of stress hormones in our body, and just to make us happier. That's good enough for me. Music therapy has an important role to play and an incredible track record in helping people to recover from things like a stroke, or perhaps as part of a treatment package for something like Parkinson's. If there's a muscular weakness on one side of the body, or a sort of lack of symmetry in the way the body is moving, music therapy can help treat that, and its results are as striking, if not more so, than from straightforward physical therapy. Often that would be using dance rhythms and things to engage different parts of the brain. If someone's had a stroke and they lose access to language, they might well still be able to access melody. So a music therapist might get them humming and singing to begin with, and then add words to that and gradually use that as a way back to spoken language. We've already seen that having music in your life can help protect against the effects of aging, but obviously no one is immune, and particularly these days there's a huge rise in the incidence of dementia. And this is a really interesting area of research around music and the brain, the way that music can help people who have dementia. It can often be a sad scenario where someone can't tell you what they had for lunch that day, perhaps they don't know who or where they are, and they can't recognise their nearest and dearest. And yet, if they're given a track to listen to of music that they knew in their childhood or in their young adult years, they can often sing along with it, perhaps even with all the right words. And this is an extraordinary phenomenon, and it's still under much research, but the benefits of singing in choirs for people with dementia or of listening to music are extraordinary. There are some amazing documentaries that have been made about this recently that are available, which I would really recommend if you're interested in this. They're very moving, and it's extraordinary to see the way that music has such an emotional footprint on the brain that it's still accessible even when day-to-day facts are completely unclear. There's so much that could be said about music and the brain, the way they interact. It's clear that music can have a profound effect on the structure and function of the brain, on health and well-being, on the development of the brain in childhood, but also right through adulthood. And it's clear that music can be an incredible tool for treating all sorts of physical and mental health issues. It seems to me that Pythagoras had a lot of it right, despite having none of the science that we have today. And it strikes me as incredible that the developments in neuroscience in recent decades have served to confirm what we instinctively knew, that music is good for us, but actually has showed us beyond probably what anyone would have imagined the extent to which the brain can be positively affected by music.